my first question is to Marilla herself, and that is, how did she begin this long journey in life of being Dymphna Cusack's biographer? Where did that interest come from? How long has it been with her? And what's its evolution to this book?
I guess the formal beginning would have to be when Julie James Bailey recruited me at the Film and Television School, which was then in a factory in North Ryde, not its illustrious present site, to work with her as a researcher, mainly because I'd had a fairly substantial input training in market research for the advertising world, and she and I both wanted to put that period into good social justice cause. And so I worked with her and a mob of great women on the making of Come In Spinner as a novel and turning it into what was then intentioned as a film, but which became a television mini-series broadcast on the ABC in 1989. So that was a 10-year journey. 1979, I first sat on the floor at Abbotsford Julie at their knees, and they talked, Florence, James, Julie's mum, and Dymphna Cusack. They yarned together about how they had worked in Hazelbrook in the Blue Mountains at the end of the Second World War to create a novel which told the seamy side of Sydney, in truth, in the Second World War, and they were no holds barred. They certainly revealed all the rackets, all the gambling, all the prostitution, child prostitution not accepted. It was in there too. They were very, very gutsy in what they decided to put out into the world as the novel Come In Spinner. And so 10 years were spent on that quest between 1979 and 1989, and Dymphna unfortunately had a stroke after the second time I met her, and could no longer be interviewed. But Florence was there all the time with her living memories over the entire decade and later. And that was the journey that led to my going to Wollongong University with Dr. Paul, as he hates me saying, and doing an MA Honours thesis on the anatomy of the bestseller, The Making of Come In Spinner. But as life went on, and it's been 38 years now since that journey began, that part of the journey began. Back at high school, I had been given a copy of Southern Steel by Dymphna to read in my HSC. Well, it wasn't an HSC year. I predate HSC. It was a leaving certificate year in 1962. And the novel Southern Steel had been an eye-opener to me. I was a friend of Anne Curthoy's, who was Jeff Curthoy's, Barbara Curthoy's in particular. She was very active in politics within the Indigenous community. And I was very, very close to them. And I'd go after school and I would learn from them what was happening in a bigger world than what I ever knew in suburban Newcastle in the 1950s and 60s. And Southern Steel, when I read it, was a gobsmacker, because back then in 1962, my leaving certificate year, it revealed to me the Newcastle that explained my parents, that explained the world in which I had grown up, which was the consequences of the Second World War in an industrial city which was caste and class divided, where, like my grandfather, the protagonist in Southern Steel comes out of a coal mine background. My dad's father was killed down a mine. And the story then moves into the aspirational generation in which I grew up in Newcastle, where my father had become a top executive at the steelworks and was overseas swanning half the year. But the rest of the family were left not exactly still down the pit, but certainly close to the pit head. And that was a big eye-opener. And I went back to Southern Steel after the work with Spinner and Julie at the film school, and I started reading the rest of Dymphna's novels. And to tell you the truth, I was on her wavelength. I mean, she was probably the person who explained to me the injustices of society. And John and Sue both know. They came into the story very early. John Grant down here and Sue, Dymphna's first his nephew from her sister B. And they revealed to me, John in particular, telling me how Dymphna had taken the story of his mum, B. Crowley, née Crowley, B. Grant, she married Randall Grant, and had used the life of his mum, which was a tragic life. It was a life that involved alcoholism treated as a criminality. And Dymphna wrote a book that was going to, and did, blast the medical profession out of the water for the absolutely disgustingly mechanistic operations that they performed on a generation or two of people with tuberculosis, when everybody with any brains and any overseas connections knew that streptomycin had been available during the Second World War and that it would kill the bug. But Dymphna had to write this book with the help of the Millises, which were a quite famous family in the Blue Mountains. And Dymphna, of course, started that novel in the Blue Mountains, as she and Florence wrote Coming Spinner in the Blue Mountains, as I wrote this book in the Blue Mountains, and as it is being published by Blue Mountains Publishers. So it's very proudly and unashamedly made in the Blue Mountains.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Marilla. So, from your own activist social justice agenda, and in response to reading Yarn Spinners, where do you find these three women fit into the movement or pattern of people who brought about the change of consciousness in Australia that took it from isolationism in the mid-20th century and to the outward-looking country that we see today? Where would these three women be today, and what would they prioritise to redress? What would they write about?
Well, they'd probably write it. Well, first of all, they'd probably be on my side. Oh, and Marilla's, and probably the rest of you. And what would they write about? Well, at present, it seems to me, particularly since the advent of Trump as President of the United States, they'd be swamped with options. And I'm not talking about the crassness of the man. I am talking about the destruction of social constructions which have been built over many, many generations, not only in the USA, but also in this country and other countries which have been want in the past to call themselves democracies, where people, well, in very recent times in Australia, have been accustomed to egalitarianism. I have been a strong critic of egalitarianism in this country, and that's been a theme of mine through many, many public lectures that I've given. First of all, because of the way in which the Indigenous people, of whom I am one, have been ignored in the grand picture of this country, and secondly, because of the way in which women have been treated. And in some respects, especially, let's say, take an example from Henry Lawson, read some of his stories, and you really understand how some women, including women in his family, of course, have been treated no better than my people were treated. But what we are confronted with nowadays is this huge reaction against Trump and what I refer to, if you'll excuse me, the forces of evil. And when I say that, I mean it with all, the strength of my inner being. The manner in which they have systematically, already from the very first day, I think from the day of inauguration when he was signing any number of executive orders, which were striking at the very heart of democracy itself. People were protesting, so they were being...
Women especially.
Absolutely, that's right. The women, because of the horrendous statements he made about women as women.
Sexism.
Thank you. Marilla and I are going to do a duet. Is that okay? I'm sure you won't mind. But it's true. Women marched in their millions, as you know, and not only in the USA, but also in Canada and other parts of the world, including here in Australia. And so that was a huge thing. And then attacking the legal institutions. Now, being a lawyer, I have as many criticisms of the legal system, and in particular the judiciary, as anybody has. But I have to tell you, our circumstances in a society would be far worse if we did not have an independent legal system which can cite executive government. And Trump tried to destroy that within a matter of days, if not hours, of his coming to power. So I don't know how these three women would write. I think they'd be overwhelmed.
I think they'd organise they got those international networks going. Miles Franklin, as far back as the First World War, sending a delegation from America to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at The Hague. She had the network, she had the women that she could contact, and she actually could do an international pull together. Now we've got digital media. Don't you reckon we could do more?
Well, actually, I think digital media, in some respects, has made these issues more difficult to deal with. Yes, I mean, communication was much slower, but in my view, it was much clearer. And I also think that the various strands in society were more clearly delineated than they are today. And if you're on Facebook, as I am, which is only a very recent sally on my part, because members of the family were posting on Facebook, and I thought that was a great way to keep in touch. I am horrified, just in recent months, at the extent to which it's very, very difficult to sort the chaff from the grain. And I mean, in one paragraph, somebody whom you might have known in the general sense through media and so forth, or even through general contacts in the community, might have been regarded as, well, you know, a reasonable person to deal with. But then some of the things that they post on social media, and they seem to think that there's some kind of, I don't know, some kind of a balloon or some kind of a shell around them that people are not actually going to find out about them, or to read and react to things that they put out there. I think that's actually very difficult for people such as those I assume to be here tonight to deal with.
It lets you connect very quickly with people of like mind too.
Yes, that's true. But it's not so easy, however, to start to generate the kind of responses that Miles Franklin did, for instance, in her day. However, I have to say this, at the same time, it can spark protests that quickly, as we saw some months ago in Melbourne, and as we saw, of course, when Trump was elected to the position. But just put social media in its context, that those responses have come very slowly, in fact. Initially, social media was just a fun thing to do. It was a bit like once upon a time you used to ring up your friends just because you had a phone that, you know, you ring the little handle and connect, and just to say good morning, how are you going, you know, come around for afternoon tea. I can see the pluses and minuses in it. At present, and don't forget, we only have to look at Obama's presidential campaign. He was the first one who used social media in a mass way to generate his campaign and get it going, especially amongst young people. But we also have politicians in this country using social media to try to basically put us in our place And you know, when it comes to Trump in the USA, frankly, I would not be surprised to hear that he's called out the militia and the National Guard and anybody else who wants to put on a uniform and actually get behind.
So we're actually into an anti-war mentality now, aren't we, with Trump at the moment? And where would Dymphna and Florence and Miles be? Their anti-war fights were very widespread. I mean, Dymphna helped bring the Hiroshima panels to Australia. She addressed conferences of 200,000 people across the USSR, anti-nuclear. And you know, that wasn't support Russia, that wasn't supporting Russia because they were equally nuclearly trying to arm up. That was just to try and generate peace. How would they try and generate peace today as women collectively across the world?
So as a literacy advocate and an internationally renowned children and young adult author with a distinct, often ethical and moral message to young people, where do these three women sit in the evolution of Australian children's literature? And in what ways, their lives and this book, are they relevant to young women writers today?
Well, I think these amazing women, you have to read this book. You will cry and you will laugh and you will cheer. You know, Dymphna Cusack suffered from multiple sclerosis. She lived a life of complete and utter agony. It was undiagnosed because we didn't have the medical skill. Mal Franklin had a shocking heart condition and she also lived in total agony. These women were greater than their illnesses. These extraordinary women. Florence James, no, she didn't have an illness, just a normal one. But sorry to say, just normal. But what's happened is, reading this book is essential for every young woman because they will understand what courage is, what having values outside social norms are. You know, Dymphna and Miles, they chose a single woman's life. Florence did get married and divorced because, of course, her husband, Pim, did the normal. He committed adultery and left her. But the bottom line is, why kids have to read this is at a time when it was such a conservative time. They were talking about abortion, rights over your over your body. They were talking about women's right to stand up for sexual abuse. They were complete Republicans at a time where Australia kowtowed in the most fawning manner to the British aristocracy. The incredible work, Pioneers on Parade, which Dymphna and Miles Franklin wrote together, was completely controversial. They satirised the Australians who couldn't think of anything more wonderful than to bow to a duke. Or, you know, those sort of, I can only say, pretentious and snobbish sort of attitudes. Australia was in the 50s very colonial, and these women stood against that colonialism. And do you know what? When their book came out, half the people said it was a total disgrace. They panned them. They had the worst criticism. Well, yes, but half the people were laughing their head off. They thought it was the best satire. And what we saw these women doing, these three women, they were breaking the prejudices of the time. Now, these women had to survive as single women. They were so sick, especially Miles and Dymphna, and she taught at endless amounts of schools. And while she taught, she wrote plays and she wrote books and she advocated for peace. Look, one of the great controversies of the time is that these three women were very, very, they were supporting communism because it was a communism not of the like of Stalin. It was a communism which is more based on the, I guess, Israeli kibbutzes at that time, where people worked together for the betterment of society. And they fought with great passion. You know, their passports were threatened. The equivalent of today's ASIO followed them for the crimes that they were committing. But young people have to read this book. I've only read it once, and I do need to read it many times. Bits here, bits there. It's so inspiring. It makes me look at myself and feel that my battles aren't so hard. The other thing is, they give an insight into publishing which I had not read before in my life. I'm a published author, and I honestly thought that modern day publishing was a new and individual sort of experience where you experience rejection, humiliation, the impact of commercialism, all the other stuff. Forget it. These women, they had it 10 times harder. And they had to fight to the death for every book that came out. Come in Spinner, 5-year journey. And so much betrayal. But they were so strong. I've never seen such women. They're just, you have to read it. But on top of that, why young people and old have to read this is it gives you an enormous amount of humour. You get insight into the entire literary time. And, you know, we have great people we admire, but they tell the truth. I just got to read this one tiny bit out. It was so funny about Mary Gilmore. You know, Dame Mary Gilmore, I mean, we all admire her. We do. She's one of the, you know, goddesses of literature. Okay, watch what Mars says. Dear Dymphna, previous to going to the play, I dropped in on Mary Gilmore. I wonder how many people take her seriously. I'm afraid she has a wide circle of believers that is wholesome. I am no lover of Churchill, but she outdoes me in every direction. She said he killed a girl in the suffragette days. Says he had Negro blood. Says he has torn down the British Empire, brought it to 3rd place. Not that she believes in great empires. Now, how many of you know that Dame Mary Gilmore is a nut? None of you. But let me tell you, all the way through the book, you'll find the dirt on Ruth Park. I mean, forget what you know. This is a book of enormous literary insight and gossip. It is so much fun. And I'm reading it and I'm laughing my head off. And I have a different view of all our great leaders. See how time changes history. That in itself is worth studying. That in itself. But one of the things that I have to say is the love between these women. It crossed oceans. I'm a writer. To co-write with someone else, believe me, is very similar to, not quite murder, but it does make you homicidal. Yeah. These women had such love and respect for each other's talents. They edited each other's work. They shared the writing journey. Coming Spinner is a masterpiece by 2 brilliant women. To read this is to teach us all the real generosity of writing. It teaches us all how to share the creative process to find truth. And Coming Spinner was so shocking at that time and so visionary for our time. This book brings it back, and it is time for all of us to read it. But the thing I just want to say, it also showed me enormous love and capacity for love. There was a young woman, Kay Keane, who Dymphna taught, and she became part of their group. she was such an extraordinary woman, and she wanted nothing for herself. And she married, a layabout, a pianist who was a woman, a gambler, a guy who slept with everything, women. It wasn't like that. So he was one of those guys, and you can imagine her family damned him. And he should be damned, he was pretty bad.
He ended up good though.
But what happened is she got TB, and the treatment was horrific in this country. And she suffered, and she died in really terrible agony. What happened was, this man, it made him, he stood beside his wife. He told her that the 9 years he spent with her were the greatest years of love in his life. And you know, what I saw in this book with these letters is these women were beyond the conventions of sexuality. They didn't care about the, economic issue of marriage or whatever. They judged people for their action and their humanity. The piece in here where Kay King dies is one you must read. I cried, and I've reread it and cried. It is the greatest love that women have for each other.
And the brain is actually beautiful.
It was extraordinary. I can't commit. I could talk about this book forever.
Perhaps,
but I won't.
perhaps we might go quite that long.
I am. I'm going to stop now. So you're right. But I cannot strongly enough commend it to you.
Go on to Dr. Paul, please. As a member of the International Network of Scholars in the field of post-colonial literatures in English, and as co-editor of the relevant volume, number 12, of the Oxford History of the Novel, where do these three feisty women fit into the history of 20th century literature and culture in Australia and worldwide?
Thank you, Larry, for that lovely question. Okay, let me just start in a sort of roundabout way and pick up a few threads from the other speakers. First of all, the idea of the gossip side of things. One of the strengths of the book is the arrangement of the letters between these three women, amongst them, so that you get a very strong sense of three different characters. And the really nasty lines are nearly all Miles Franklin's, which is, again, we think of Miles Franklin as the sort of goddess of Australian literature, but she was a disappointed and a quite bitter lady many times, and she does the dirt on all sorts of people, usually women, which is interesting. And I think that comes down to a lot of the power play of culture, which is a roundabout way of answering Larry's question. That one of the things that happens is when you push down from the top, the angst goes sideways. So there's a kind of, Australia was a very small place. It was a small pool of a lot of people fighting to get published. And, the bitchiness was, well, it's still with us. Go to a poets' meeting anytime. But you can see it in Miles's correspondence. Very funny, very witty, and very nasty. But you do get a sense of these three absolutely different characters, and I'm not sure whether anyone is doing this job, but a sideline is that I would love to see a proper study of Florence as a go-between, as a promoter, as an entrepreneur for Australian literature, because this is a history of the emergence of Australian literature as we know it. And certainly when she was a reader for a publishing company in England, she was also the conduit for getting other Australian writers published, including, I was surprised to know, Mugaroo, which is fascinating. So there's lots of interesting stuff behind the scenes, as it were, and for those of you who haven't already cottoned onto the fact, this is like a sequel. This ends at 1954. There's more story to be told, and the next volumes will be telling it for us from Marilla. But I'd also like to... November.
Loves
Yeah, stay tuned.
It's one chapter away, and it's with the publisher. So yeah.
On the history of publishing in Australia, I'd just like to congratulate the publishers of this version. Has anyone seen the previous edition?
With shit.
Okay, if you happen to have a copy as I do, it was published in, I think, 2001. It looks like it's come from 1792. It's already brown, the pages are dry and crinkling, and much as I absolutely admire UQP for the work they've done for Australian literature, the quality is crap. And it's the issues that Susanne's already talked about the problem of getting published at a distance, as it was in the 1950s and before that, for a small audience. Australian readers kept the British literary market afloat because we bought about a quarter of British book publication. But you couldn't publish it in Australia on its own because the market was too small and the distances for distribution were too difficult, and that's still a problem in some respects. So these people, and you can see it ironically in Miles Franklin again, who keeps telling Dymphna, stay in London until you get established before you come back again, because she'd come back too early, as she saw herself, and failed. So publishing-wise, I mean, as I say, it's a history of Australian lit. Through my doctoral studies and in the first years of my job at Wollongong Uni, teaching literature, including Australian at the time, there were people who would regularly come up and say, Austlit, are there any writers in Australia worth studying? And one of those was my colleague in Wollongong, and he said, oh yes, I read Austlit, it was on the plane coming out here. And that was D.H. Lawrence's Kangaroo. So, these women are the pioneers in that sense. They still did have to go to London to get published and to get recognised before they could get an audience back home, as it were. In doing that, they were subject to all sorts of prejudicial arrangements. There was the thing called the Traditional Markets Agreement, which meant that if you were publishing in Australia, you had to publish through England, and if you wanted to get into the American market, you had to go through an English publisher to get into the American market.
Cartelism.
That the British publishers, they're very nice about the British publishers. They say, thank God, they treat us like we're important people, whereas if we try and give a book to an Australian publisher, it's like delivering an illegitimate child on their doorstep. And there are instances of Australian publishers just really not being up to scratch on how the market worked. But even with that higher degree of professionalism in Britain, you would get published in Britain, they would ship it to Australia, they would ship it at colonial rates. They would sell it more cheaply, and they would sell it where the royalties went to the author at the price it was sold in Australia.
To the retailer, not to the publisher.
To the retailer. So you were losing money all down the chain, compared to when they started to work it from the Australian end and send it back, which took a long, long time to happen. So these people were fighting against that, and interestingly, Dymphna moved from Heinemann to Constable at one point, and she got the best deal I've ever seen. I've been working on Tom Keneally, who was writing until he won the Booker Prize in the 1980s. He was fighting British companies for decent contracts and so forth, many of which were the same contracts as Dymphna got. But the one she got with Constable is the best one I have ever seen. through to the 1980s. So
Steel, by the way.
she was a wheeler dealer, and good on her.
She had a good lawyer.
Yeah, well that's true.
Murray Bars.
Yeah, Murray Bars, yeah.
She did.
Although I'm not sure Murray had anything to do with Constable in London, but there you go. Anyway, they
It
were.
had to do with the company's
The point is,
business
they all three of them were professional women becoming professional writers and developing a professional career as women. And that is significant in itself, but they're also doing it as Australians. And a particular point of interest for me is when Dymphna gets the ship to England and she goes through the Panama Canal to the Caribbean, and the ship takes on not just British soldiers going back home, but a whole bunch of Caribbean people.
600.
Blacks, my dear. Oh, God help us all. This is the very beginnings of the reverse migration to England, of what we now know as Black British writing, of what became known as Commonwealth Literary Studies, through which a lot of Australian writing became internationalised. So again, Dymphna is at the forefront of
The post-colonial moment, Paul?
the post-colonial moment. Yeah, it wasn't known as that then, but never mind. So the book she writes, The Son in Exile, about that journey, about that sudden confrontation of the British Empire with the kickback from having an empire, is important in itself as a historical, cultural moment in British history, but it's also important in the wider literary studies history, where suddenly we become aware that there's all this writing happening around the world, from particularly the British Empire through the English studies side of things. And I mean, the corollary of that is that she is writing the truth through fiction, as we've already mentioned, and that implies realism at this time, left-wing socialist realism particularly. This becomes a dividing line. How do you tell truth through literature? Modern times, since Salman Rushdie and so forth, it's all magic realism that tells the truth through literature. Then it was something quite different, and that's become a dividing line, which ultimately, as fashions shift, have pushed these ladies and Kylie Tennants and etc. off into the background of certainly academic studies. It's time they were brought back again, and they will be brought back again, because one of the shifts that's also happening is not studying just national literary formations but transnational literary formations. And this moment of contact with the Caribbean has again an interesting feedback for Australia, in that one of the writers from Trinidad migrated to Australia and produced a lovely novel called The Crown Jewel, a guy called Ralph de Boissiere, and became a West Indian writing, but West Indian writing published in Australia, which of course was not very well noticed at the time, but it's there. It was part of the Frank Hardy circuit, another moment. We were already, while we were becoming Australian literature, part of global literature and that circulating network. Now I'm probably talking far too long.
Paul. I think that's perfect, actually.
Can I add a little
No, I
note
think it's a
here?
very good note to end on.
Can I add a little note to this? And that is, getting it to young women has been my mission. And I had conversations with the English Teachers Association in the last week, and I'm really proud to report that we are developing together a unit for Year 11 women in English, and collaborating using websites which will make the information available to teachers to actually teach Dymphna, Miles and Florence in the high schools, which I think, the main thing out of all of this is that people get led back to their books, and that's the way of doing it.
Great, thanks.
On the issue of Asia or whomever, I read one little page on it, and it was 7 p.m. Parked outside the South Sydney Hotel. Suspect went inside, had a look. He was smoking a cigarette with Bill Smith, thing you all know, sort of thing. And that was it. He left there at 10 o'clock, and this bloke sitting there. I've seen a movie or a show on Australian about that. They're sitting outside the pub, and it was as dull as dishwater. And they've spent thousands of quid on it, It must have been hilarious.
It was a propaganda battle, Don. It was as simple as that. And it was very easy for politicians to, like Trump, rake up hate and get in on a wave of hate and fear, building borders and walls and all that sort of stuff. Menzies fought that exact battle back in the referendum and back in the 1951 elections. And he was prepared to change Australia's constitution to bring out a death penalty for membership of the Communist Party. That's why Norman had to go, because Lance Sharkey was already in jail for sedition. So Norman had to leave. He went west, as you know, and she went east, and they met up in London again on the anniversary, 3rd of September 1949, and never parted again.
Yeah, so there you go. ASIO couldn't write. Any more questions? Yes, Marilla.
I guess that story you tell there where sounds like they left Australia secretly to
Oh.
meet up again on the other side of the world. She wrote so much about the lives of women and the hypocrisies that they had to endure in their lives. And that, like, I mean, her romantic life was so clouded by hypocrisy and secrecy.
Well, she and Norman first met in 1928 when we do the sum. She was 26 and he's 10 years older than her. He's 36. He's married and he's got 2 kids. And they begin a mentorship relationship more than an emotional one, because she was referred to him by the local Minister for Education as a likely candidate for writing great books about Australia. And Norman nurtured her intellectually. He bought her books every time he saw her. He gave her a different book. Fenner Brockman's The Bloody Trade was the most important one in 1933, about the arms industry across the world. And it continued like that through their lives. And they were sort of on and off lovers, I'm pretty certain, from the early 1930s. But definitely they were sincerely involved from the early 1940s, when some of those love poems that you've got were written to him. And they were together forever then, from 1949 until they both died, without much more than a week apart. I think Dymphna came back in 1956 or 57 for little Dymphna's marriage, and she went to Queensland and saw her brother. But that was the only time they were ever apart in that entire next 20 years together.
Well,
it's a great love story, and that's the second volume.
And on that note, I think it's time that we ask Nerida to come up and sing those songs.
The acknowledgement is a with in a much lower case. It's not even enough acknowledgement in the book, but it is at least there. But he's not being credited at all on the film of the book that is bound for great awards, and that's the film that's just been launched, called Lion. This is a current social justice issue for writers that Miles, Dymphna and Florence will be out there fighting for big for sure through their lobby organisation, the Fellowship of Australian Writers. We've got the ASA, there is an FAW still going, and I intend to trigger them on it as well. What most people don't know is that Larry travelled to India with Saru and recovered his whole story and researched and wrote the book 70,000 words in 3 months. Wow, exactly, wow. And I saw the stress that he's a neighbour of mine in the Blue Mountains, and I saw the stress it placed on him. Ghost writers should not be discarded when their work generates international acclaim. To treat a creative as a mere functionary is insulting and it's unjust. So all writers in the audience today, and we need to spread this message, and we need to organise on it fast and get some protocols worked out with the ASA and then put it out in the public domain.
Thanks, Marilla. I now want to
cover her grave with shells the sea has carried. the sea and chalice. As she, the drifting tide of all